Okay, call it to order, please. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Any declarations of community interest? Seeing none. Delegations, none. We do have some staff presentations, but no public presentations. Just a heads up that the webcast is down, and they may have to reboot the system. So if they reboot the system, the speaker's queue will be defunct, so we'll just have to go old school. Raise your hand, and I'll put you in the appropriate order. Okay? Community Innovation Grant. What's the recommendation there? Is any comment on that? Moved by Councillor Foxton, seconded by, oh, you got a question. Well, we're still working now, okay? So we'll get it on the floor, though. Could someone second it, please? Councillor Erb. Okay, hang on. Councillor Harris.
Yeah, thanks. I just have a question with regards to the recipient. It's the community association or neighborhood association. I'm just wondering, do they have a physical location that they're going to do these communal things at? I mean, do they have a property or an address? Or there wasn't. I don't think it didn't further elaborate in the report, unless I missed something.
Okay. Councillor Kiefer, Kinbridge.
They are a neighborhood association.
Yeah, and they have a neighborhood community center, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
I do have some questions too, but I'll wait in the queue.
Okay. Councillor Harris, does that help?
That'll satisfy my...
Okay. All right. Councillor Kiefer, please continue.
Yeah, I'm just wondering about this motion, because I'm not sure that the city of Cambridge has made up their mind as to what they're going to do with this at this point. I'm not sure if staff have that information or not, but we were looking for perhaps a deferral on this to see what would happen. It's not that we're against necessarily the funding going to Kinbridge, but in reading the report, it's, you know, it talks about moving people around, and you know, if you have neighborhood associations and they take up the task here, then of course you don't need to necessarily you know, move people around. But there's more questions here than there are answers, I think, and so I'm just throwing it out there. I'll listen to what everybody else has to say.
Okay, Councillor Jowett.
Thank you, Chair Strickland. I have to concur. Carl and I attended the council meeting where this was presented to council, and they have deferred it because there were some concerns around some of the questions. It's already a very food insecure sort of, we don't have a lot of resources dealing with food insecurity as it is, and to deplete any of those resources by having fundraising compete with the food bank and some of those other questions, they've been very strongly pursued around the City of Cambridge Council. So I'm hoping that our council will respect the autonomy of that council so that they can look a little deeper into this.
I'm not sure the role of the City of Cambridge in the awarding of these grants. Councillor Clark.
I can provide a little bit of information because I did meet early on with the group that was bringing the proposal forward, and I did send them in the way of the application. They do have an idea that they wanted to have fully funded for 2 years, which would involve the region and the city, and that was one application. My understanding is that this is for a pilot and it's a separate piece. Now, I haven't seen the application, and there's no staff here to ask about that. But I do wonder about our role as council. I don't believe we've ever asked for this sort of detail for the community innovation grants before. I believe they've always simply been brought to us with a recommendation from staff.
Yes, so, you know, the genesis of these community innovation grants is that we established that committee, I think, last term. We established parameters, and we left it to staff to run the evaluation process, and the community submitted applications, and the staff makes a recommendation to bring forward. Of course, we can always decide if we agree or disagree, but we haven't done a lot of the legwork on this, and I think we have to trust the the good work of staff. Similarly, I had a chat with a councillor before the meeting today. Similarly with our environmental grants, you know, we spend significant amount of money there, over $100,000 I think every year. Staff collect all the applications, they make recommendations, and we approve them. So I'm reluctant to send this back based on information that I've heard already this morning. Councillor Chair Redmond.
Thank you, Chair Strickland. I apologize because I was out of the room, and I don't know if this is, I'll look to Mr. Dyer. Is this where I should talk about the policy, or is that later on?
It might be best to have the discussion about the grant, arrive at a decision, and then at the conclusion, discuss the terms of reference.
Thank you.
Councillor Foxton.
Thank you. As I understand it, this is a community grant to bring individuals together. And if I read the report right, and I could be wrong here, did not the Cambridge Food Bank get it last year? I thought that was stated in the report. Yes, thank you. So it's not that it's competing. It's more that I read it as a social bringing together of community. And so based on that, I don't see why we wouldn't go forward. It sounds like a marvelous idea.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Clark?
Thank you, Chair. I would simply say that if our concern is that the funding is contingent on Cambridge funding and the money isn't used, my assumption is that, like any contract, if the money isn't spent, it comes back to us.
I think that's a very good assumption, yes. Yeah. All right, so I got a couple more speakers and then I want to call the question. So I would suggest if there's concerns, we defeat it and then we send it back to staff. And if we pass it, we pass it. Councillor Galloway.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got some concerns about this as well, and I do think it needs to go back for further review, or I do think we should be following the suggestion of Councillors Kiefer and Jowett in regards to what this money is intended to provide for, and see if that lines up with our own priorities and our own strategic plan.
Okay, Councillor Kiefer.
Thank you, Chair Strickland. I concur with Councillor Galloway and Councillor Jowett on this, and I think it's not that, like I said, the funding I would like to see go to Cambridge. However, there's questions here that need to be answered, and I would feel more comfortable if staff, you know, came back with more of those answers that we would need on this. And so for that reason, we're looking for a deferral. We're not saying that we don't want this, but
okay.
A deferral.
So a deferral subject to what questions being answered? Hang on for a second, Carl. I'll turn your mic back on.
Sorry. As Councillor Jowett said, we want to concur with the City of Cambridge in terms of how they're looking at this, and I get your statement you made that they really don't have anything to do with this, but in fact they do, because they're responsible for neighborhood associations. So take it for what it's worth, but I think it wouldn't hurt to have a go at this thing.
Okay, not to be too argumentative, but we fund neighborhood associations as well. So I don't understand what's happening behind the scenes here. I'm feeling a little bit uncomfortable about process, but there is a motion to deferral. You know, I don't think I want to spend another hour on this. It's a significant grant to this organization. It's $50,000, not a large sum of money as far as the region's concerned. So what I'm going to suggest is that we take the motion to deferral and have it come back subject to more input to council. Okay, so I'll take that. If it passes, it does, and if it doesn't, so moved by Councillor Kiefer, second by Councillor Harris. So on the motion to deferral, all those in favor? 1, 2, 4. Okay. I was hoping I'd get away with that without any questions. Chair Redmond.
A motion to defer, so I would like to know when this is coming back. I think just to defer it and put it out in the ether.
No, in the council, the next council
The
meeting.
next council meeting?
Yeah.
Because I have met with this group, and this is one of the things that we suggested as a council that they consider applying for. So I'm happy to get additional information, but in absence of some new information that is sort of gobsmacking, I would definitely support this. So if it's coming back to council, I can
Yeah.
support that.
Well, I would agree. I support the recommendation as well, but in fairness to the group, if we're going to defer it, let's defer it only until next Wednesday at council and make a final decision. All right? Okay, so let's see those hands again. All those in favor of the deferral? Those opposed? That's carried. Thank you very much. Okay. Mr. Dyer, proposed amendments to Consolidated Investment Policy 4.2.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is a follow-up report to the discussion that took place, thinking either at the previous or two meetings ago. You'll recall that we had representatives from AMO LAS here to provide a presentation with respect to the One Fund and the various products offered by the One Fund. This report proposes amendments to the consolidated investment policy to essentially provide some additional options with respect to the investment of regional funds. With us today, we have Tricia Alpa, who's our Manager of Financial Services, who has a brief overview of the report in a presentation form.
Okay. Welcome.
Through you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, councillors. We'd like to provide some additional context on this investment report recommendations. The report includes recommendations for additional investment options. The three are eligible corporate bonds with a term up to 5 years, up to 10% in the general portfolio, and 20% in the sinking fund portfolio with no more than 5% in any single corporation. Secondly, eligible corporate bonds with a term greater than 5 years through the One Universe Corporate Bond Fund, up to 10% in the general portfolio and 20% in the sinking fund portfolio, which was one of the presentations that were made two committee meetings ago. And lastly, equities through the One Equity Fund, which is the only way the Act permits investment in equities, and 10% in the general fund and 20% of the sinking fund. Over the next few slides, we'll share with you why staff recommend adding these to the region's investing options. Overall, the goal is to allow responsiveness to market conditions. Market conditions are continually changing, and these are tools to help increase investment income for funding of capital programs and to help meet sinking fund obligations in the future. This graph shows the relationship of increasing risks and returns and where the various investment tools fall along the spectrum. The bottom left quadrant consists of investments for the shorter term with a minimum risk and generally less return. And as you move along the graphed line, the investing time frame increases. Now, we've marked on here, the region's investment portfolios are currently invested in products that are geared to shorter-term investing. But actually, the portfolios have a mix of short, medium, and long-term needs. The region's investment policy currently is geared to investment options to meet the shorter-term goals, and staff are recommending additional investment options to incorporate the longer-term horizon where and when appropriate. For the sinking fund, it will be very challenging to find investments to meet the required rates of return. To give you some background, the sinking fund debt was issued in a higher interest rate environment than the current and projected market conditions. And also some additional context on sinking fund is, unlike serial and installment debentures where annual principal repayments are made, sinking fund debt has a payment of the full principal at the maturity, and contributions are made to the sinking fund annually at a rate that's based on what the projected income could be earned on the contributions to be able to achieve the full principal at maturity. So to illustrate this point, the flat horizontal line shows the rate of return needed on the sinking fund investments for one of the sinking fund issues. If you look at the green line, it shows that prior to 2018, staff have been able to invest at or above the required rate of return. However, the blue line shows that partway through 2018 and is forecasted over the next few years, it's becoming more challenging to find investments within the region's investment policy that meet the required rate of return in this interest rate environment. Also, looking at funding for capital programs, additional investment tools to help increase investment income can help with funding of capital programs, lessening the burden on increased taxes and user rates. It can potentially reduce the amount of debt financing needed and strengthen the region's financial position. So lastly, we leave you with a visual illustration on the One Equity Fund. If the proposed 10% maximum of the general portfolio had been invested over the last 5 years, the portfolio value would have been $3.5 million higher. Does anyone have any questions?
I don't, Councillor Galloway, do you have a question for staff, or you make a comment on the recommendation? Okay. I don't see any questions. Thank you very much. Okay, Councillor Galloway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support the recommendations and would move those at the appropriate time. I do want to express some concern, however, about the one group of funds, equity fund, which our presentation we had from them a month or so ago has no provision for green funds. And they are the only fund that we can invest in if we want to get into the equity business. Many of us were at the economic forecast last week put on by Mr. Dyer, the business development. What was the bank?
Was National Bank Financial, one of our fiscal agents.
Yes. And after that event, I spoke to the gentleman who has our portfolio, and I think, Mr. Dyer, you might have been present at that side conversation where I spoke to him about green funds. And it turns out that we could, green funds on the debenture side come in at almost the same rate as our, that we currently enjoy. And green funds on the investment side also enjoy similar rates of return. So I'm wondering if we could add to number 3 that we would advocate to AMO and the one group of funds that it considers having a green fund investment, equity investment portfolio available for municipalities to consider. Not asking that we change our policy, but maybe that we just advocate for that so that we have a choice in the future to go with their regular fund or with a different product that they would have. They are the only organization that we could consider for equity funds. Otherwise, we can't look at commercially available investments. We could only go through one group for equities. So I'm sure they're getting a lot of questions from other municipalities in this regard, I suspect. And all I'm asking is that we add to number 3 that we ask them to consider the putting together of a green fund for future consideration.
Councillor Galloway, I would suggest we make that item 4. Let's make it a separate
that's fine.
one. Yeah, that we direct one group of funds to explore the feasibility about the creation of a green fund option for municipalities.
And Mr. Chair, I would also, just for context purposes, the next item on our agenda is the Region Strategic Plan, and climate action is one of the two key focuses
Yeah.
of our strategic plan.
Okay. All right, so I think we'll just add that onto the recommendation as a friendly. I don't think there's any objection for anyone on committee. I have a couple of questions, and I understand the rationale to look for the best returns for our money. I guess where you have to make a distinction is between, managing our portfolio, managing the risk of taxpayers' money, and chasing returns. So when I look at page 16 of our agenda package, and you may have a different page number on the electronic version, but and it's got the 5 years of returns. And in year one, our current investment strategy beat one USB and one equity fund. In year two, we had better returns than these equity funds. In year three, slightly less, but we still averaged 8% across our portfolio, which is a decent return by any stretch of the imagination. It's only in year five where we fell down a little bit, where we still had 8% and the equity funds had 10%. So when I understand the need to generate maximum returns, or to the extent that we can as provided within the Municipal Act, this is a big departure for us to invest in equities. And I don't think now is the right time for us to invest in equities. Corporate bonds, I could see that, I can support that. But I don't think right now is the right time for us to invest in equities. Don't want to get into financial planning aspects of it all, but you don't need to move past page one of financial papers to look at all the concerns that exist in the world today about being at the top of the market, and all the other concerns about trade, and all these headwinds that we're facing in our economy, and OECD is calling for a world economic slowdown. I don't think now is the time for us to invest in equities. I'm not sure if there's ever a time for us as a municipality to invest in equities. And when you look at that page on page 16, we do pretty well for returns for our taxpayers without investing in equities. And I don't think exposure to that additional risk is worth a little bit of an uptick in return. So the recommendation's there. I'm going to suggest that we take item 3 separately. I'll let my colleagues decide on how you want to proceed with investing in equities, but I'm not going to vote in favor of item 3 where we would invest in equities. Okay, so we'll call the question. Let's take items 1 through 4. Sorry, do you second it? Okay, so thank you, Susan. Items 1 through 4. All those in favor? All right, that's carried. Item 3, with respect to investing in equities. All those in favor? Well, I got to count. Oh, you have a question, Councillor Galloway? We're on a roll there. Councillor Galloway.
I do share your concern, Mr. Chair, about that. And is there some middle ground here, however, where we could change the policy, but the actual investment, if and whenever it might occur or staff may recommend, would come back to council for an endorsement?
I could live with that. And the question is really about timing of the market, and people say you can never really time the market, but I could live with that as a middle ground, but I still have my concern about us investing in equities, period.
I agree with you, and I think that to decide to do that is very strategic, but I'm not opposed to changing the policy, but that investment decision would come back to council at a future date, and I would like staff to react to that if that's practical, possible, doable.
Mr. Dyer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So a couple of comments. The first would be in terms of the amendment to the policy, amending the policy as recommended in the report should not be equated with we're going to go out and invest to the maximum amount immediately or tomorrow or even in the near future. What the policy amendment gives us is the ability to respond, react, act as required to reflect changing market conditions at any given time. So please don't confuse amending the policy with making the investment decision. That could happen soon. That could happen at some unidentified point in the future. With respect to a circumstance where the policy is amended, but the investment decision is brought back to council, as staff, I would recommend against that. I think it will be problematic. It will not allow us to respond as market conditions are changing if we're working around council meetings. I think, as is the case in many examples across the region, council sets the policy, staff implement it, and I think that would be a much more appropriate approach. If your level of discomfort around equities is significant, you should not approve recommendation number 3.
Well, in that regard, then, Mr. Chair, I'll vote against number 3 as well, because I have the same kinds of concerns, but also I have that additional concerns that the equities there's no green fund option for those for equities.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Chair Redmond.
Thank you, Chair Strickland. I was actually going to echo some of the comments that Mr. Dyer made, which is if you're against these funds and moving to your portfolio in this direction, I think you should vote against it. I think having it come back to council is untenable. I don't know about the rest of you, but I actually think that I would hire smarter people than me to make these decisions, and we can't sort of game out what the markets will bear. I don't have a problem with supporting this. I will support it, and I would also point out that I think that our staff, in an abundance of caution, have done very well over the years. I don't think they would do anything rash, and I know that at that economic update provided by the National Bank, they went out of their way to commend the timing and the discretion of our staff in making investments and finding places to fund our debt. So I do this with confidence that the staff will make the right decision when they have all the facts, and I don't need to have them.
Okay, so and none of my comments are suggest that staff would act rashly. Actually, in contrary to that, when I started with my comments, I talked about the great returns they've delivered over the past 5 years. So I have great confidence in staff. With me, it's more of a fundamental disagreement that municipalities should be investing in equities. That is where I come down on this issue. So we've approved 1, 2, and 4. So we'll call the question on number 3. Those in favor of the recommendation for equities? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's 7 in favor. How many against? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's carried. So item 3 has been carried. All right. Thank you very much. It's got to be ratified at council. Yeah. So it may live another day, is what you're saying, Councillor Galloway? The recommendation's got to be approved by council next week. All right. Thank you. Appreciate the discussion. Strategic plan, Mr. Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to make a couple of comments by way of introduction. So in front of you today is a recommended strategic plan. I would just point out a couple of things. One is there's been a significant amount of community input that's informed the plan. There's been a significant amount of council discussion, debate, engagement that's really informed the plan. Frankly, I think the level of engagement by this council in crafting this plan has been more than I've seen with previous councils. A couple of things that have struck me over the course of the year as we've worked on gathering community input, community engagement, and working with council on the plan. I think there's 3 areas of focus that have really emerged. In the context of all of the detail in the plan, to me, 3 areas of focus really stand out. One that we've talked about earlier today is a focus on homelessness and affordable housing. That's been a strong message from just about everybody in the community we've talked to said, homelessness and affordable housing is a significant issue, and the region needs to continue to take it seriously and needs to ramp up what we're doing to try to address it. So that's one. Councillor Galloway has talked a couple of times today about focus on climate action. That, again, was a significant and consistent thread through a lot of the public engagement and through a lot of the council discussion. So, and I think the plan reflects enhanced focus on climate action. And the third is active transportation. It's related to climate action. We've heard about the need to continue to invest in transit, cycling, walking, active transportation, and providing a broader range of transportation choices for the community. So those strike me as kind of three areas of focus that have emerged and that I really think are reflected in the plan. I would just like to say a couple of other things. A huge thank you to the steering committee that guided the work. So that included Chair Redmond, Councillors Jowett, Erb, Shantz, and Verbanovic. And I'd really be remiss if I didn't thank Laurie Fiozzi, and I think Laurie's here. As always, Laurie's done a tremendous job of really engaging the community, gathering and summarizing a huge amount of input, working closely with the Council Steering Committee, and working with the whole corporate leadership team, senior management team, and probably hundreds of regional staff to shape this plan. So thanks to the Steering Committee, and a huge thank you to Laurie, and we're open to questions.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Murray, and thanks to you and the entire staff team for all the work that you did throughout the process as well. We all come up with ideas, but you guys have to go back and do the tough sledding and see how workable they are. Councillor Galloway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At the appropriate time, I'd like to move the strategic plan. I'd also like to thank staff and the steering committee for the work that they put into this. We've gone through a number of iterations, and it has been quite malleable throughout that particular process, as each iteration captured new and important input from the community. I'm particularly pleased that affordable housing, climate action, and active transportation are the key elements of this particular strategic plan. And I thank council and staff for their support of some of the recommendations that I put forward. They didn't all find their way into the strategic plan, but I'm quite pleased with what did. And I know that a number of those other initiatives will find their way into departmental plans because they may not have been broad enough to qualify for a corporate-wide strategic plan. But this is the document then that gives the marching orders, the mandate to staff to proceed in certain ways. And we're going to have it even tested later this morning when we deal with a particular project. But it's really, I'm really happy that we're at this point. We're already 1 year into our mandate with three years left, but I'm looking forward to the possibilities coming out of the strategic plan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Councillor Galloway. There's no further questions, so you move the adoption of the strategic plan, seconded by Chair Redmond. All right. All those in favor? All right, against? That's carried unanimously. Thank you very much. Okay, Councillor inquiries. Other business, Mr. Dyer has some good news from a quiet but well-known and reputable organization with respect to the region's finances. Mr. Dyer?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. We back in June, early June, staff met with the credit analysts from Moody's Investor Service to do our annual credit review, and advised yesterday with the release of the updated credit opinion that our AAA rating is maintained for another year. With a stable outlook, so we're delighted by that result. I think that's if I have it right, I think the 19th consecutive year with that rating. Of course, it's the highest rating that Moody's offers, and so we're in a select group of municipalities at the top of that list. The credit profile will be sent around to council. We have a press release going out shortly, and a brief report will come out on the addendum agenda for council next week.
Great. Excellent news. Congratulations to staff and to councils over the past 19 years in terms of managing the region's finances in a prudent manner. Of course, that rating really helps with our borrowing costs, and the less we have to pay on interest for borrowing, the less we have to go back to our taxpayers for that kind of money. So good news all around. All right, thanks, Mr. Dyer. Next meeting, December 3rd, motion to adjourn. Councillor Foxton, Councillor Shantz, all those in favor? That's carried. Thank you very much, everyone.